Reece has joined us to share his insights on global mobility. And as a global mobility lead, what does 2024 bring? How to plan for it. So big thanks for being here. Maybe to kick things off, I wanted to learn more about your journey, how you got into global mobility. Let's start there. How did your career kick off, and how did it get to your current role at Personio?
Yeah, I'd love to say that it was a calling from above, but I graduated in 2010, and the economy was not great. It was picking up from the crash of 2008, and I just sensed that I needed to get a job as quickly as possible. I was very fortunate to get a PwC graduate scheme program, but that was actually in expatriate tax, so it was kind of expat facing, but it was more compliance focused, UK tax legislation, double tax treaties, which gave me a very solid base of understanding how double tax treaties work and how cross-border considerations work, but it was pretty dull after a couple of years, so I moved into the consulting side. So client-facing, being able to speak to clients about setting up policies, managing policies, looking after their clients as well. And that gave me a great range of experience because we had single company startups who were just one person who wanted to move somewhere else, all the way up to financial services clients that had tens of thousands of people moving on a yearly basis. So it was a good scale. I got an opportunity to move to the Middle East and lead the consulting arm in Qatar for 2 years prior to the World Cup, which was a great experience as well. But wanted to move back to Europe, and I know I wanted to move into a people-facing role and take responsibility for that kind of in-house, end-to-end experience. Very lucky to get offered the role at Personio, and they asked me where I wanted to be in the world, in any of their offices. But all of my team were based in Munich, so I said, Germany sounds fun, let's do that. So I jumped on a plane and headed to Germany, and then took it from there, basically.
That's definitely an exciting journey. You're an expert yourself in Germany. You relocated here, now you help others move. How does that experience come together with your work?
I think it helps give a little bit of empathy as to what you want the experience to be for people. I had a great experience with Localyze moving into Germany. I had a pretty average experience moving to Qatar before that, where the support was pretty limited. So you know what works well and what doesn't. Even for myself, just moving as a single guy with 2 suitcases, pretty simple and straightforward move, and someone who's pretty laid back anyway. The stress of the immigration processes, visas, applications, really appreciate what people are going through, and probably more so when you think people are moving with children, with family, moving from way further across the world. They don't speak the language, which is a challenge that I've had in Germany as well. I think you really appreciate what you want the experience to be for others so that they can hit the ground running. They don't have to worry about all of the stuff that goes with being in a new location, housing, all of the stresses that you might have, but you want them to just be able to be as relaxed as possible, so they have the best experience and the business gets the best out of them as soon as possible as well.
Yeah. No, that's great. During my keynote, I spoke a bit about the changes, underlying changes, trends. You have a lot of experience. You've worked in global mobility for a long time. What are the things that you've observed? What has changed? And what are also the things that should still change?
Well, I think you touched upon one of them in the first session, and also I was just speaking with Don at the back, and we both touched upon it, which is historically it was very senior executives, very kind of expensive, complicated moves. There were complicated tax equalization policies and big assignment-related benefits. And I think that has kind of slowly shifted down to kind of more traditional moves prior to COVID. And then post-COVID, there's just been a massive shift in where the power lays. And it's with people now. It's a lot of individual-driven moves, a lot of requests for workcations and short-term considerations as well. And I think there needs to be a far more holistic approach to moves, supporting people throughout that whole process, as I touched upon, like the housing and finding schooling for children and all of that stuff as well. So that's really important. What hasn't changed, also something you touched upon, is legislation. It's glacial in its pace of change, isn't it? And it's just really not fit for purpose now in a new world that we have with short-term moves and people taking workations and short-term, working from other locations. So that's something that I would really like to see change and reflect the world that we live in now.
I feel like we're still in a period of change because after COVID, there was the shift towards everyone being fully remote. Now back to office with like some flexibility around companies deciding to stay remote or like settling somewhere in the middle. And we're at the end of this year. What are the things that you're seeing for next year? What are the changes? And also, how are you planning in a world of uncertainty?
Yeah, so I think on that topic, it feels like we've been talking about kind of working from anywhere and workations for a while, but whenever we've had kind of advisory boards or panels, there's always a lot of people who they want to put a policy in place, but they haven't got there yet and they don't know quite what that looks like. So I think it's a good opportunity for companies to really think about what they want their culture to be, what they want their values to be, and how that's reflected in that policy. Because it can be a great motivator for people to join. It can be a great motivator for people to stay if they have that possibility as well. But you have to think about how that fits into your culture. And I think it fits into a lot of wide-ranging decisions, like the decisions we're making now on real estate. May be very different to what they were 2 years ago. Do we need an office? Do we need the size of office that we might have needed 2 or 3 years ago? So because those decisions are so long-term when you're kind of getting a commercial lease for a business, that can have a huge impact as well. So I think it's a great opportunity, and I think there will be more focus on that. As I say, hopefully the legislation will catch up. And then you have the unknowns as well. There's still a little bit of economic uncertainty, and I think that will factor into budgeting as to, the decisions that people want to make around who they hire and where they hire from over the next years, and maybe being more strategic and focused in their hiring when it comes to global mobility. And then you have the unknowns, as we saw last week in Israel and last year in the Ukraine, the world can always throw surprises at you, which can have impacts from a global mobility perspective, things to consider and actions that you need to take as well. So.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I think like there, also from a legislation perspective, you never know what's changing when. I think like a lot of companies know that there's parts of global mobility that will always stay, that will do hiring internationally, also secondments, business trips. But then, as you said, also workations, different kinds, or as you said, like Personio allowed you to choose the office if an organization wants to really allow flexibility between choosing the office. I feel like there is also still some kind of experimentation towards like what are also the things that people appreciate, what is feasible, what is also something, what is the investment, what's the ROI. What would you say, maybe doubling down on the planning, how much is like fixed things that but like what are test balloons that you would still consider?
Yeah, so I think you have to kind of decide early on what your appetite to risk is, and that can change. We're probably getting to the stage where we're thinking about IPO in the next couple of years, so you maybe have to tighten the strings a little bit compared to a few years ago. But I think you can put a pretty flexible, generous policy in place with a pretty low risk approach. Certainly from what we've seen in practice over the past couple of years. Haven't really seen too many challenges, either from Personio or in the market generally, to pretty generous working from anywhere policies. So you have to be sensible, understand the legislation, but if I talk a little bit about what we have, so we have an international working policy where everyone can work in another country for up to 3 months a year. Broadly speaking, if it's an EU country, they could do that all in one block if their team were happy with that and they wanted to do it. If it's a country outside the EU, then it's generally limited to around 2 weeks. So it's pretty flexible. We do push it a little bit if there are, personal reasons or family reasons. We obviously try and be flexible, but it's a model that most people can work within, gives them the flexibility to go and do what they want, and it makes admin on our side, which is an important thing as well. It makes that pretty easy to manage for us. We had over 6,000 days, I think, of Personio Flex, as we call it, last year, around 1,000 employees. So it's a really good take-up. Lots of people using it to its maximum, and it is constantly reflected as one of the the biggest perks of working there, and people really do make use of it. So I think there's a lot of value in that. Yeah. But yeah, I think just deciding on what your approach to risk is and then coming up with a solution that works for you can be done without being too complicated or too time consuming.
Yeah. Speaking about the admin side, I think that's an interesting one because there was so much change in the last years. How are you dealing with that? Like, do you always say, okay, this is the program that we have, and then taking on like different projects for different case types, for example, for different like policy changes, or like, because otherwise, if you would just take on like everything that's requested here and there, I imagine it could get a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, within assignments, we're pretty straightforward because we only really do permanent relocations. Yeah. So that's pretty clean. With regards to the working from anywhere policy, we do support people with A1s and certificates of coverage if they need it, but we do have a kind of de minimis days where we're like, if you're going for less than 10 days and it's in the EU, yeah, we're not going to bother. If you want us to, we will request it separately. Otherwise, just agree it with your manager and go and do it. So, yeah, I think you can be sensible in your approach so you're not drowning in admin, because otherwise we would be just constantly kind of pumping out A1 certificates and doing the paperwork, which would be no fun for us. But that way it's not something that takes up too much of our time, and it's something that we're always looking at ways we can automate and make easier as well. Yeah.
You mentioned the number of days that were taken with Personio Flex. I guess you are looking at like all the numbers to also analyze the effectiveness of the programs. Did you have a bigger learning of maybe like something that wasn't taken up that much, like maybe a policy that you had to adapt, or something like where the numbers have shown you a trend also in a very short time?
I think because that was quite new, that's the first kind of batch of data we've had from that. So within that, there weren't too many takeaways. I guess the specifics were actually more people were pushing outside the EU, where we had the 2-week limit. And what we need to revisit, and what we are revisiting at the moment, is, well, we have like 100 Brazilians who work for Personio, we have 100 Indians. They want the ability to go home, and they want that reflected in, having equal approach to somebody who's from the EU, or myself who was going to go back to the UK. And so we need to maybe think about how we adapt the policy to make it fairer. We also had limitations for kind of growth managers and account executives because they're potentially signing contracts. That's extra risky from a PE perspective, and maybe that doesn't really play out in what we see in terms of challenges from immigration authorities or tax authorities. So maybe we can think about simplifying that as well. But in general, the take-up was really good, and I think people are really positive about it, which is a good thing. Yeah.
In terms of also what you mentioned, you could choose the offers. Personio has multiple offices, is really international. Is that also something that you are seeing quite a lot, that people want to switch, for example, between offices, spend time there? Do you have a specific policy around that?
Yeah, so we've seen a marked increase, I would say, over the past 12 months in internal mobility requests. So we did framework that out. I think a lot of people just want to go to Spain and enjoy the sun. That seems to be the main driver. What's nice is that we have, again, just by keeping it simple, if you request a move, as long as your team is comfortable and happy with it, the business will support any visa or immigration needs. Individual will be on their own in terms of the relocation. So from a financial point of view, we're not having to pay for everybody with full relocation support, but we're pretty open about that. So we have a policy in place there. Request it with your lead. They'll speak to the people partner, and as long as there's agreement and that the job can be done in a new location, then we can make it happen, which is a nice thing for me to be able to have that kind of super open policy, and we have seen a real increased take-up over the past 12 months. So. Yeah.
I feel like that is really a very, very interesting potential as well. As an organization, I think maybe also something that changed. Like 20 years ago, it was more normal for a company to first reach like 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 employees before they really opened a lot of international offices. I think like right now, organizations start going across borders early as well, which of course is a benefit because then employees can switch between offices. It's easier to enable that. What is your view, maybe looking at the broader trend, they're also tying kind of like the talent mobility to the organizational setup?
Yeah, I mean, it's been huge for us. Obviously, having companies like Localyze that can support us mean you can do that a lot easier because you don't have to have all of that expertise in-house. But it's been vital to our growth so quickly. So last year, I think between 20 and 25% of all of our new hires were relocation candidates. So we had a massive number of candidates that we were moving. And yeah, they've come from all over the world. I think we're over 100 nationalities now, and just being able to get that talent in at the right time, to give them the flexibility in a lot of cases to go, okay, well, it's a big move for you to come from the US to Europe, but where would you like to be? Would you like to be in Amsterdam or Germany or where? So it's definitely opened up our flexibility, reduced hiring time, and has really helped us in particular with some senior or specific hires where there are talent shortages in Europe, to be able to get those people in the door quite quickly as well. So yeah, it's been a huge multiplier for us. I mean, as you say, it's definitely something that's a trend. Some companies are now starting out and are just being completely remote, like we'll use an employer of record or something and we'll just hire people wherever they are. So it's interesting to see how quickly that has changed post-COVID.
Also interesting, tying it to the first panel that we had around maybe like countries are having also different paces in terms of legislation changes, but also different welcome cultures. And I think that is really also becoming a factor. Like if people can choose in which country they live, and then you start seeing patterns and like countries have to fight for talent. How are you seeing that as well in terms of like from an organization perspective? If you look at different offices and maybe like their popularity, you mentioned Spain, which I think is an obvious one. Like the weather is also a very big factor during winter. But as someone who moved to Germany, where we've talked about the welcome culture not being the very best always, if you compare it to other countries, do you see very similar changes in each? Do you see differences and also kind of like different trends in how fast they're improving?
I definitely see, I think, improvement across the board. So Germany is an interesting one because I was reading an article the other day. It was like one of the biggest expat companies that, I think they interviewed 12,000 people. And Germany came out really poorly in terms of like the initial welcoming culture for people, which I think is something that was reflected a little bit in the earlier session as well. And I do wonder with the changes to like the blue card rule in Germany, it's great that you're encouraging more people to come, but at the same time, if the paperwork still can't be done because you still have all of this bureaucracy, that's probably going to get worse before it gets better because you just don't have enough people dealing with the paperwork. So yeah, we've definitely seen, I think, problems with a few cases in Germany. But in general, yeah, places are opening up. Spain's just recently made changes to the blue card as well, encouraging people to come. But I think people aren't necessarily looking that deep into the welcome culture. What the drivers seem to be for people who have the opportunity is like, where's the best pay? Where can I maybe be tax efficient so I can go to Amsterdam and take part in the 30% ruling, for example, and that can be super tax efficient. The Beckham law in Spain really encourages expats to come. So there are definitely financial motivators, but then there are also trade-offs. Maybe the salary in Spain is not going to be as strong as it would be somewhere else as well. Housing and schooling. So if a city like Amsterdam that has a reputation for being quite open and good for English speakers, lots of international schools, then that's a positive as well. So the language can be a choice as well. So I think there's definitely a lot of different motivators, and every case is different. Somebody who's moving with children will be focused on, where they can find good schooling for their children, and that might be key. But someone else may be really focused on, I want to come and take advantage of a certain tax scheme for a few years and really maximise my earnings. So there's a lot of different drivers, but I think, there will be an increasing drive to make it open and welcoming for talent so that you get the best talent here as well.
Definitely. Also, coming back to like more the admin and like how to manage all of that. Of course, like now with the rise of AI, there is parts of process that we can automate, but still, on the other hand, human touch is important, and like cases are very, very different. You mentioned in the beginning, if you move like as a single guy versus like someone with a family, 3 different pets, an exotic parrot, very different. And so, how do you see that?
Sounds familiar. Yeah, I think moving myself just really opened my eyes to the fact that a career move for somebody across a border can be one of the most exhilarating, one of the most exciting, but also definitely one of the most stressful touch points in somebody's career. So you really need to have that human touch at the other side of it. The technology is great, it simplifies things, it makes things very clear in terms of the processes, but people really want a human on the other side to be able to speak to vent to when things aren't going well. If you have delays with a visa, for example, you don't want to speak to a robot or an AI who's not going to have a personal response to you. So it's finding that balance, which is key. So yeah, leveraging the technology to make the process as smooth and as easy as possible for everyone on all sides, but you definitely need to have the human touch there as well. Yeah.
I see it personally really interesting. Like, I think the potential that you have to work on governments, for example, like processing, really reducing error. I think that is something where there's a big potential. And also then really like further downstream in terms of personalized recommendations for the individuals. What are the things that, what is like really the best sports club? Where can you find friends? So this is like something that we also explored very early on when we started Localyze, because that was some of the things that I personally found difficult when moving. Like finding housing visa, that is tough, but then it continues. Like, how do you really settle in? And so that is also something that I'm seeing a big potential, but would love to get your sense, like, is there anything else where you see a big potential?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I moved to Qatar, as I said, and I knew absolutely nobody. I moved to Munich and I knew absolutely nobody. So once you get through that initial process of like, okay, I've got my visa, I found my house, settled in, and then you're like, oh, okay. I don't really have that kind of social aspect to fill your time because you haven't built up that social network yet. So the quicker you can start to put that in place for somebody, I think there's huge value in that. Having a network from early on, different sports, as you say, there's different challenges often for like a spouse who's moving and maybe their partner is working but they're not working, so they're at home and they're really isolated. Having other people in that scenario, I think there's great opportunities to kind of help build up networks, and also just encourage people to do it, because ultimately, like, you maybe have to put yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit and go and speak to people more than you would be used to if you're quite introverted. So you have to go out there and build a network, but any kind of frameworks you have to help that along the way, I think would be hugely valuable as well.
And finding a veterinary for the exotic parrot, not an easy one. Going back to trends going forward next year, I feel like now, or also I mentioned Gartner, some of the research of them that we're looking at. There is some research around the next years on, for example, companies really going, like that went global quite fast in the last years. Also did so in a remote setup with employers of record, and now thinking more about where they actually want to have their own entities, being more, and I think like that is something that I can also relate to, like more intentional, because we, for example, did a lot of test balloons, like tried out things, and it's not always easy to find like what really matters. And so there's like trends around how many countries, for example, do you allow people to be employed in? Do you where do you set yourself up in terms of really fully remote? Some countries with offices, one country with one big office, but then also the cases around like, what are really like the macro trends that you are seeing there? Do you have like anything where you'd also say, okay, like this is maybe an unpopular opinion, but like something where you have strong feelings around?
Good question. I think, just to speak very quickly on what Personio did, so we've still always been very office-based, so we've always tried to hire people into a country where we have an office. They can be on a remote contract occasionally. We have very few people outside of where we have a legal entity. And I think my unpopular opinion would be, as someone who's a massive champion for flexible working and remote working, is that I think there's really good value in having office space for people to collaborate in. Spoken to and hired somebody just into my team recently who came from a kind of company that was moving to a fully remote setup, and he really wasn't comfortable with that because he liked having time in the office, he liked collaborating with people, he liked that face-to-face space. So I think a hybrid policy is probably the strongest choice, just from personal preference. So you have the ability to go in and have that office space, but also, you have time to work away from home. And as you say, that can then impact what the size of the office looks like and the design of the office, because you might have a certain number of people in that country, but they don't all need to be in at the same time. And maybe you need to plan for that and have a little bit of formality, so you don't have 100 people coming in on a Thursday and 0 people coming in on Friday. But I think that flexibility is key and where it is. And I've definitely seen so many different approaches in the market. Like you say, there's no one size that fits all. So I think you just have to understand what you're trying to achieve as a company, what you want your culture to be, and then go from there. But,
And do you see regional difference in terms of uptake of the office, like what percentage of people is going? Because the statistic on availability of remote or hybrid jobs across countries varied quite strongly.
Yes. Spain is one where I don't know if this is just specific to us. I'm sure it's not, but I have someone in my team in the Spanish office, and she was in there on Monday, and it was just like dust blowing behind her. There's just nobody in there. Whereas like on a Thursday in Munich, when we have our all team, then the office can be really, really full. So I think we've definitely seen different take-up. It's lower. I don't know if that's maybe a cultural thing, that there's just less take-up in Spain. People are more comfortable working from home. But there are definitely significant differences across the offices that aren't just explained by long-term trends that are clearly very different in how people approach it. So I think part of that will come from just having very different sized offices as well. Munich we don't call it a HQ, but it's the biggest office. The other offices are obviously new, and so they're growing up. There's not always many people there. They can't, even if it's full, maybe it's like 16 people, so it's never going to be that full. But take-up will come as those offices grow, but there are definitely changes across the countries.
Do you see strong differences between teams, and do you also allow for different policies? Like, that's something that I've seen different needs. For example, R&D does not push for more, let's say, like meetups, like trying to see each other. For them, it's fine. Like they have their own way of working, whereas other teams like really enjoy and like love to meet in person and want more of that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of our kind of product and engineering guys, if they're just coding away, they're quite happy to just be at home. Sales teams love to be in the office together, smashing the phones, ringing the bell when they make a sale, so they're in the office like 5 days a week, making the most of it. But I think most of our approach has been to just empower the teams to do what's best for them. So sales teams are encouraged to be more in the office. Other teams, there's a hybrid approach. As long as it's working for them and they're getting the most out of people, they're pretty happy to have that flexibility as well. Yeah.
I think that's a super interesting one. Of course, like it increases complexity because like then suddenly you have to navigate different teams, different locations, but ultimately there is differences across jobs of like where do you need more connection, where it's really fine, like if you have that focused time alone for you. But I think that is an interesting one, like also planning for next year, because as I mentioned in my keynote, there is a long-term trend that I think we can all agree on, more flexibility, etc. But like also setups, policies, and the way that we manage it is changing over time. And so making sure that we do it step by step, but also have a vision of what is the setup that really fits with the culture that we have right now and that we also want to build on going forward. I think that's really important. But not as easy always. Before I open it up for the Q&A, I wanted to ask one final question to wrap it up. If there's like one thing that you would have as like takeaway for this audience, really like something that everyone should factor in into their 2024 global mobility strategy, what would that be?
I think coming from my background in consulting, when global mobility was a kind of hot potato that nobody really wanted to deal with in the business, it was like, is this a tax problem? Is this a HR problem? It's nice to know now that global mobility is at the forefront of important stages in a business's culture. So I would say treat it with the respect it deserves, be a champion for it, and push for these policies and these flexibilities, because it will have a really positive impact on your culture, on your outcome, on your staff retention, on everything. So really be a champion for it. Also, maybe to just follow up there, what do you think is the best way to like put global mobility at the first point of every CEO's agenda? For me, I'm quite lucky. I had to move a couple of the board members, so it's nice to know that I have champions at the top of the agenda. So create a problem for them that you have to fix. Once they have sight of that, I think. I don't know that there's any easy way. I think it definitely has more visibility anyway, but once you solve that first problem for senior leadership, where they want that person in desperately, and you're able to deliver on that, I think they see the value in it. But I think it's just a topic of conversation now, so it's not going to go away, fortunately for us. But it's a good one. I remember at some point when I was talking to 1 or 2 investors, there was one who said, immigration, like moving across borders, I don't see it as a problem. Like, why should it be that hard? And I was like, you never left that country, like 100%. Doesn't matter.